It was a quiet evening. She was sitting alone at a small table in a cozy, dimly lit restaurant, enjoying a peaceful meal, though there was something a little lonely about the scene. Alone, but not in a sad way, more like an introspective kind of solitude. She'd been through enough moments like this to know that it wasn't the worst thing in the world to have dinner alone. Sometimes it gave her the space to reflect, to think, to simply be. But tonight, it felt different. The soft murmur of conversations around her, the clinking of silverware, the occasional laughter, all of it felt like it was happening at a distance, as if she were a part of the world, but not truly in it. She was used to being alone in public places, but there was something oddly distinct about this moment. Maybe it was the way the evening light cast shadows on her plate, or how the quiet seemed to amplify her thoughts. Regardless, she found herself staring at the flickering candle on the table, lost in her own little world. She hadn't expected the evening to take any turn at all. But then, it happened like a shift in the air. Something she hadn't anticipated at all. A man, out of nowhere, it seemed, sat across from her at the table. She hadn't even noticed when he arrived, but there he was, sitting comfortably, smiling as if they had known each other for years. The stranger leaned in slightly, his voice soft, yet clear. At first, she thought she misheard him. It wasn't an ordinary request, and certainly not something she was expecting in a setting like this. Her initial reaction was confusion. Why would he say something like that? She glanced up, half expecting to see some sign of a joke or a hint of sarcasm in his face. But no, he looked entirely serious. Yet, there was something strangely casual about his demeanor, as though he didn't expect a huge reaction, as though he wasn't asking for anything at all, just a simple, almost nonsensical suggestion. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The words lingered in the air between them, and all she could do was stare. The situation was bizarre, yet in a way, it felt strangely comforting. It wasn't an invasion of privacy. It wasn't a flirtation. It was just a simple, almost whimsical request that left her wondering. Why not? Her mind raced with questions. Who is this person? What does he want? Why would he even suggest something like this? But then, another thought crossed her mind. Why not play along? After all, he wasn't being intrusive, just odd, in a way that made her smile. It was a challenge to her usual way of thinking, a moment to break out of the mundane routine that often defined her days. She gave a small, half smile, unsure of where this conversation would go. But then she realized, sometimes the smallest gestures could completely shift your perspective. Maybe it wasn't about what he had said or why he said it. Maybe it was just about acknowledging the human need to connect with others, even in fleeting moments like this. After all, wasn't it those little, random connections that often left the biggest impact on us? The idea of pretending, just pretending, for a brief moment didn't seem so bad. It didn't require any commitment, any real involvement. It was just a playful suggestion, a way to break through the walls of isolation that often surrounded her. And in that moment, it wasn't about finding a boyfriend or forming any real bond. It was just about feeling a little less alone in the world. Her thoughts were interrupted when he spoke again, this time with a gentle laugh. You don't have to pretend for long, just for the moment. What's the harm? It was an odd request, to say the least. But there was something about his tone, something about the way he spoke, that made it seem like it wasn't such a strange idea after all. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed like a harmless bit of fun. No strings attached, no expectations, just a quick escape from the usual solitary existence she had grown accustomed to. Maybe it was the simplicity of it all that caught her off guard. Maybe it was the realization that she didn't always have to do things the normal way. Maybe, for once, it was okay to break from the routine. She found herself saying, almost without thinking, "All right, let's pretend." For the first time in a while, she felt the weight of her own solitude lift. It was as if the conversation, however strange, had suddenly made the evening feel less lonely. It wasn't about a deep connection or a profound, life-changing conversation. It was just about sharing a small, fleeting moment with another person. And just like that, a simple dinner had become an unexpected adventure. What started as a solitary meal turned into a brief encounter that she would remember. Not because it was life-altering, but because it reminded her that sometimes all it takes is a small, unexpected moment to shift our perception of an ordinary evening. As they both sat there, the man across from her smiled, as if he had just pulled off the most casual, yet oddly charming, little trick. There was a twinkle in his eyes, a playful glint that suggested he knew something she didn't. He wasn't pushing for anything more than the brief connection they were sharing in that moment, and that made her curious. Who was this man? What did he want? She had seen her share of people in restaurants, some with their heads buried in their phones, others deep in conversation, and even a few couples who seemed to have forgotten the world around them. But this man was different. He wasn't making her feel like she was just another patron in a busy place. He wasn't looking for an excuse to chat, nor was he trying to impress her with some witty line or awkward pickup trick. No, it was more like he was simply there, in the moment, offering something unusual and unexpected. She paused for a moment, her fork halfway to her mouth, contemplating his request. It was such a simple phrase, yet it carried so much potential. "Pretend I'm your boyfriend." What was the harm in playing along? She wasn't looking for a relationship, and certainly not from a complete stranger. But what if, just for a moment, she could let herself experience something outside the ordinary? It wasn't the kind of thing she would have considered on any other day. She wasn't one to entertain spontaneous strangers or their offbeat requests, but there was something different about this interaction, something intriguing. Maybe it was his calm demeanor, or maybe it was the way he made the request sound like it was just a harmless game. Whatever it was, she found herself intrigued. She took a deep breath and set her fork down. "All right," she said, surprising herself with her own response. "Let's pretend." It wasn't a commitment to anything, she reminded herself. Just a small gesture. But in a world where everyone seemed to be caught up in their own lives, their own busy routines, the idea of stepping outside that for a moment felt strangely liberating. It was as if, for just a few minutes, she could step away from the person she was and become someone else, a version of herself that wasn't bound by the usual expectations and roles. The man didn't seem to push her any further. He simply leaned back in his chair, his smile widening a little. "Good," he said, settling in more comfortably. There was something about his presence that was disarming. He wasn't trying to force a deeper connection, wasn't asking for anything beyond the simple acknowledgement of her response. It was almost like an unspoken agreement between them. They were both playing this little game, but without any real stakes. For her, it was freeing. There were no consequences to pretending, no expectations. She didn't have to impress him or prove anything. In that moment, it was okay to just be. For once, she didn't have to worry about being judged, about being seen as an outsider or an oddity for dining alone. For once, she could let go of that weight, even if it was just for a little while. The conversation shifted slightly after that, though it never lost the playful tone. The man asked her simple questions, ones that didn't require much thought, but just enough to keep the dialogue flowing. They talked about little things, where she was from, what she liked to do, and how her evening had been. It wasn't deep conversation, but it didn't need to be. They weren't looking for a profound exchange. just an escape from their individual worlds. For her, it was a relief. It felt like a momentary break from the isolation that often crept in when dining alone. The evening, which had started off as just another solitary dinner, had transformed into something far more engaging, a brief but enjoyable connection with a stranger who had simply offered her the chance to pretend, if only for a while. As they continued their light conversation, she found herself loosening up. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, but for the first time that evening, she felt like she was in control of the moment. It wasn't about impressing anyone or fitting into a particular role. It was simply about being present, enjoying the company of someone who wasn't demanding anything from her. She didn't have to think about her usual life, her usual routine. She could just exist in this small, shared space. And the strangest thing was, she didn't even mind that he was a stranger. The fact that he wasn't someone she knew made the experience feel almost refreshing. There was no history, no preconceived notions about who she was or what she should be. It was a blank slate, a new beginning, even if it was just for one evening. So they continued, talking, laughing a little, and enjoying the absurdity of the situation. She was pretending that he was her boyfriend, pretending that this moment was something more than it was. But, in a way, that small act of pretending made her feel less alone. It allowed her to momentarily step out of the loneliness that usually accompanied these solo meals and into a more connected, even if fleeting, experience. The evening was still young, and the restaurant still held the same quiet hum in the background. But for her, the energy had shifted. It wasn't a night spent just eating alone. It was a night spent with someone who, although a stranger, had managed to break through the isolation and make her feel like she wasn't just another face in the crowd. As the evening wore on, she couldn't help but notice how easily the conversation flowed. It wasn't forced, and it didn't feel like either of them were trying too hard. It was like two people who had stumbled into a conversation and were simply enjoying the moment. There were no expectations, no pressure to make the conversation meaningful. It was refreshing in its simplicity. She noticed that as the minutes passed, her body language shifted. She had started the evening sitting rigidly, stiff with the weight of her solitude, but now she found herself leaning forward a little, her posture more relaxed. She was comfortable, and that was a rare feeling when you were used to dining alone. She felt heard, seen, in a way that she hadn't expected, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel strange to be conversing with a stranger. His questions were light, easy, and thoughtful. He wasn't prying into her personal life or asking about her most private thoughts. Instead, he was interested in the little things, the way she liked her coffee, her favorite kind of music, the last book she read. The questions were simple, but they had a way of making her feel like her opinions mattered. It wasn't that they were talking about anything life-changing. It was just the act of sharing, of exchanging small details that most people wouldn't notice. For her, it was almost like a reminder of how important it was to connect, even if only for a brief moment. So often, she found herself caught up in the busyness of life, the constant rush of obligations and responsibilities. But this was something different. This was a moment of stillness, where the world outside the restaurant felt distant, and the only thing that mattered was the conversation happening between them. She found herself laughing a little more, her shoulders loosening as she let go of some of the tension that had built up throughout the day. He had a way of making her feel comfortable, as though they had known each other for far longer than just the few minutes they had spent together. It was funny how a stranger could make you feel like you were part of something bigger, even if only for a short time. At one point, she caught herself wondering what he saw in her. What made him approach her, of all people? Why had he chosen her, a woman eating dinner alone, to make this odd request? It wasn't as though he was trying to flirt with her. He wasn't looking for a date, and he wasn't trying to impress her. But there was something about him that made her feel like she wasn't invisible. For once, she wasn't the person eating alone in a corner, unnoticed by the rest of the world. She was part of something, even if it was just for the evening. Maybe that was the beauty of it all, the simplicity of the moment. In a world that often demands more, sometimes the most meaningful experiences are the ones that don't require anything at all. They don't need grand gestures or profound moments. They just need two people, sharing a conversation, exchanging smiles, and letting go of the pressure to be anything other than themselves. And she realized something then, something that had been sitting in the back of her mind the entire time. It wasn't about pretending. It wasn't about imagining him as her boyfriend or playing along for the sake of it. It was about the feeling of connection, of being seen and acknowledged even in the most unexpected of circumstances. She didn't need him to be her boyfriend. She didn't need to pretend. She just needed this simple, unspoken bond that had formed between them in a matter of minutes. The conversation continued to flow, easy and natural. The small talk was comfortable, and for once, she didn't feel rushed to finish her meal and leave. She could have stayed there all evening, talking about nothing in particular, and it would have been enough. It wasn't about the destination, it was about the journey. The act of sharing time with another person, without expectation, was enough to make the evening feel full. She looked at the man across from her and realized that this might just be one of those moments that she would remember for a long time. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was so ordinary. It was a brief encounter, a moment of connection that didn't have to lead to anything more. It was just two people in a restaurant, sharing a moment of humanity, and as they continued to talk, she realized that sometimes those are the moments that stick with you the most. Not the grand, life-changing events, but the small, unexpected interactions that remind you that, no matter how isolated you may feel, there's always the possibility of connection. Sometimes, you just have to let go of your expectations and allow yourself to experience the moment as it is. As the evening continued, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background, becoming more of a soft hum than a distraction. The moment they were sharing felt suspended in time, as if everything else, the world, the people around them, the routines of everyday life, had been put on hold for this small, almost insignificant encounter. And yet, it felt anything but insignificant. She found herself reflecting on how rare it was to experience a genuine moment of connection with a stranger. In her everyday life, she was constantly surrounded by people, family, friends, co-workers. But those interactions, though meaningful, were often wrapped up in expectations, history, and the complexity of relationships. It was rare to find a conversation that didn't come with baggage, a moment that didn't require the negotiation of personal history or the weight of mutual understanding. But here she was, in a quiet restaurant, having a conversation with a man who didn't know her, didn't expect anything from her, and yet somehow made her feel seen. What was it about this encounter that made it feel so different? She had been in countless situations where she'd been surrounded by people, yet still felt a sense of isolation. She had been in relationships, both romantic and platonic, where the connection was real, but still, at times, incomplete. But this was different. This wasn't about trying to impress or fit into some predefined role. It wasn't about looking for something deeper. It was about a simple human connection. In its most basic form, she thought about the way he had spoken to her earlier. It had been a strange request, one that could have been awkward or intrusive if he had approached it in any other way. But the way he had said it, with no expectation, no pressure, had made it feel light-hearted, almost playful, and it had been a moment that allowed her to let go of the usual walls she built around herself. What struck her the most was how easily he had broken through those walls, how quickly he had made her feel like she wasn't just a solitary figure in a room full of people. It wasn't a romantic gesture, nor was it a complicated invitation. It was just a brief, spontaneous moment that reminded her how often we overlook the simple connections that happen every day. She realized something about herself in that moment. She had spent so much of her life building walls, keeping others at a distance. She had convinced herself that she preferred being alone, that solitude was a comfort, a place where she could control her environment and her emotions. But tonight, something had shifted. The walls she had built had cracked, even if just for a moment. She was reminded that it was okay to let others in, to experience moments of vulnerability, even with people who weren't part of her inner circle. As she looked across the table at the man, she felt a sense of gratitude, not for anything grand or life-altering, but for the simple reminder that connection was possible, even in the most unexpected of places. She didn't need to look for it in the usual places, and she didn't have to wait for some dramatic moment to feel seen. Sometimes, connection happened when you least expected it, in small, quiet moments like this one. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to let go of the pressure to always have everything figured out, to always be in control. She realized that it wasn't about needing a deep, lasting connection in every interaction. It was about being open to the possibilities that each moment offered, no matter how small or fleeting they might seem. She smiled, feeling lighter than she had when she first entered the restaurant. The weight of the evening had shifted from one of isolation to one of simple connection. She wasn't looking for a boyfriend, or for anything more than what this moment had offered. But in that brief, shared time, she had found something valuable. She had found the ability to connect without expectations, to share a moment with a stranger without the burden of needing it to lead to something more. And as the evening drew to a close, she felt a quiet contentment. The meal was finished, the conversation had come to a natural end, and the man across from her was gathering his things to leave. But there was no sadness, no regret, just a sense of calm that had settled over her. The evening had turned into something beautiful, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was real. It was a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful moments come from the most unexpected places. She stood up, ready to leave, feeling a little more connected to the world around her than when she had first entered. The man gave her a small nod as he stood, a silent acknowledgement of the shared moment between them. And with that, they both went their separate ways, their paths likely never to cross again. But in that one brief encounter, they had shared something meaningful, something that would stay with her long after the night had ended. As she walked out of the restaurant, the cool evening air hit her face, sharp and fresh, a contrast to the warmth she had just left behind. Her mind wasn't racing, nor was it particularly quiet. It was full, but not in a way that felt overwhelming. It was as if the events of the evening had subtly shifted her perspective, leaving behind a sense of peace, of calm, that she hadn't realized she was missing. She had come to the restaurant to eat alone, to have a solitary evening, something that had become quite familiar to her. But she left with something more, something that was hard to define, but unmistakable. She felt, for the first time in a long while, a little less alone in the world. It wasn't because of any grand gesture, any deep conversation. It was the simple acknowledgement of her presence, the shared moment of humanity, that made her feel connected, even if it was fleeting. As she walked down the street, she thought about how rare it was to encounter someone like that. Someone who wasn't trying to gain anything, who wasn't pushing for some deeper connection, but who simply offered a brief moment of shared existence. It wasn't about expectations or what would come next. It was just two people, connecting, even if just for a few minutes. She smiled to herself, walking a little more slowly than usual. The weight of her solitude had lifted in the smallest of ways, but in a way that felt meaningful. It wasn't something that would change her life, but it had changed her night, and sometimes those small changes were enough to make a difference. She thought about how often she'd let herself get caught up in the loneliness of being alone in public. How many times had she walked into a restaurant, sat down at a table, and felt invisible? How many times had she convinced herself that being alone meant being disconnected from the world? Tonight, however, she had learned that being alone didn't have to mean being isolated. It was possible to share a moment of connection, even with someone she'd never see again. The streets were quieter now, the city settling into the night. She found herself taking a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. There was a peace in it, a kind of contentment she hadn't expected to find on such a simple evening. She had spent so many nights telling herself that she was fine on her own, convincing herself that being alone was something to embrace, that it was preferable to the messiness of human connection. But tonight had reminded her that sometimes connection was exactly what she needed. It wasn't about needing a romantic partner or trying to find a deep, life-altering relationship. It was about the human need to be seen, to be acknowledged. That was something she hadn't realized she was craving until it happened so unexpectedly. And it wasn't about a person's words or actions, it was about the presence of someone who saw her, who offered her a small moment of connection without any expectations attached. As she approached her apartment, she found herself reflecting on the simplicity of it all. There was no grand story to tell, no dramatic twist, just two people, briefly crossing paths, sharing a moment of humanity. And yet, in its simplicity, it had left an impression. The night had turned out to be far more meaningful than she'd imagined, not because of what was said or done, but because of what was felt. When she walked through the door and into the quiet of her apartment, she didn't feel lonely. She didn't feel the emptiness that she had felt before. Instead, she felt a sense of warmth, a sense of connection that she hadn't realized she was missing. It wasn't something she could hold on to or define, but it was there. And in its own way, it was enough. As she settled into the quiet of her apartment, the events of the evening began to sink in. She had walked into that restaurant expecting nothing more than a solitary meal, and yet, that simple, unexpected moment, a stranger's request to pretend I'm your boyfriend, had shifted her evening in a way she hadn't anticipated. It was strange how small things like that could leave a lasting impact. It wasn't just the novelty of it, nor the weirdness of the request. It was the effect it had on her, the way it made her view her solitude differently, even if just for a little while. It wasn't the first time she had been out to dinner by herself, and it surely wouldn't be the last. But there was something about tonight that had felt different. She had learned something important, not necessarily about the stranger or the encounter, but about herself. How often had she let herself slip into the pattern of thinking that being alone meant being disconnected? How often had she assumed that being alone in public meant she was isolated from the world around her? She had built walls around her walls of self-reliance, walls that told her she didn't need anyone else to feel complete. She'd convinced herself that being alone was a form of strength, that solitude was a choice, not something to be feared. But tonight, she realized something. Being alone didn't mean she had to shut herself off from the world. It didn't mean she had to disconnect from humanity. Sometimes, all it took was a small moment of kindness, a fleeting connection, to remind her that she was not an island. She wasn't invisible, even if she spent time alone. That was the beauty of what had happened earlier. The man hadn't given her anything tangible. He hadn't offered her anything more than a moment of shared space and an invitation to pretend. But in doing so, he had unknowingly broken through a barrier she hadn't even realized she had built. It wasn't about pretending to be in a relationship or anything else. It was about allowing herself to connect, even in the smallest way, with another person. She smiled to herself as she thought about it. It wasn't like she had met someone who would change her life. It wasn't like she had found some profound connection or deep revelation. It was just a moment, small, fleeting, and yet significant. It had reminded her that it was okay to open up, even for a brief instant, to a stranger. It had reminded her that being human meant sharing those small moments of connection, even when they didn't lead to anything more. She stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The streetlights flickered softly in the distance, casting long shadows across the pavement. The world outside seemed so vast, so full of possibilities. And yet, here she was, standing in her apartment, reflecting on a small encounter that had shifted her evening. It was a strange thing to think about how a moment that lasted no more than a few minutes could alter her mood, her perspective, and the way she viewed her own solitude. There was a sense of peace now, a quiet acceptance that had settled within her. She didn't need anyone to complete her. She didn't need someone else to fill the spaces in her life, but that didn't mean she had to shut herself off from the world. That didn't mean she had to always carry the weight of solitude as if it were a badge of honor. There was no shame in reaching out, in connecting, even in the smallest of ways. And sometimes, those small moments were all it took to make her feel a little less alone in a world that often felt overwhelming. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of her phone buzzing on the counter. She walked over and picked it up, seeing a message from a friend she hadn't spoken to in a while. It was a simple check-in. "Hey, how are you doing?" She smiled, feeling a little lighter. Maybe the evening had been a reminder that she wasn't as isolated as she sometimes felt. Maybe it was a sign that the connections she sought were there, just waiting to be noticed, even in the most unexpected places. She typed a quick response. "I'm good. Just had a quiet dinner by myself, but it was nice." Sometimes those small moments are the best. As she hit send, she felt a sense of contentment settle in. The evening hadn't been anything extraordinary. There had been no life-changing conversation, no new revelation about herself. But in its simplicity, it had offered something valuable. It had reminded her that sometimes the smallest moments, the briefest connections are the ones that can have the greatest impact. They don't need to change the world. They just need to make you feel a little less alone in it. And with that thought, she turned off the lights and headed to bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new experiences, new encounters, and maybe even more small moments of connection, just like tonight. The next few days passed in a blur, with life returning to its usual pace. But every now and then, her mind would wander back to that evening. The restaurant, the stranger, the strange request to pretend I'm your boyfriend. At first, it seemed like just a passing moment, something that would fade with time. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it had subtly shifted something within her. Something she hadn't noticed at first. She hadn't expected it to stay with her. After all, it had been such a fleeting encounter. One stranger in a restaurant, one strange request, and then they had parted ways. It seemed insignificant on the surface, but the impact it had on her was undeniable. It wasn't the request itself that lingered. It was the way it had made her feel, the way it had broken through the walls she had carefully built around herself. For the first time in a long time, she felt open to the world in a way she hadn't been in years. It wasn't about seeking out new relationships or looking for deep connections. It wasn't about pretending to be something she wasn't. It was about allowing herself to be present, to be open, to connect in the smallest ways. It was about acknowledging that it was okay to let go of the control she had always clung to let herself experience the moment without overthinking it. She found herself more aware of the small moments of connection in her daily life. A smile from a stranger on the subway, a brief conversation with a colleague she hadn't spoken to in a while, a shared glance with someone at the grocery store. They were all small, fleeting moments. But now they felt more significant. She realized that it wasn't the grand gestures that made her feel connected to others. It was the small, everyday interactions that added up over time. It was easy to overlook those moments when you were focused on everything else, when you were wrapped up in your own thoughts, your own world. But now, she made an effort to notice them. She smiled more, made small talk with strangers, and allowed herself to be present in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be before. It wasn't about looking for something. It was about being open to whatever might come her way. Her friends noticed the shift, too. They commented on how she seemed a little more relaxed, a little more open. "You're different lately," one of them said over coffee. "You seem more connected." It wasn't a huge change, but it was enough for them to notice. And it was enough for her to feel like something within her had softened, something that had been rigid for so long. It wasn't that she had suddenly become an extrovert or that she was now constantly seeking out connections. No, it was subtler than that. It was the quiet realization that she didn't have to hide behind walls of self-sufficiency all the time. She didn't have to be isolated in her own little world. She could connect when she wanted to, and she could embrace those small moments of human interaction without feeling vulnerable or exposed. And as she thought about it more, she realized that the key to it all was the acceptance of those small moments, the ones that didn't seem to matter much at the time, but in retrospect, made all the difference. The man at the restaurant hadn't asked her for anything, hadn't expected anything in return. He had simply offered her the chance to pretend, to share a moment of connection without any strings attached, and in doing so, he had given her the freedom to embrace the possibility of connection in a way she hadn't allowed herself to do before. It wasn't the act of pretending that had changed her. It was the act of being open, of allowing herself to be part of something, even for just a few minutes. She had let go of the need to control every interaction, to keep everything on her terms, and in doing so, she had found a sense of freedom she hadn't realized she was missing. As the days went on, she continued to notice those small moments, the moments that, in the past, she might have ignored or overlooked. She realized that connection didn't have to be big or dramatic. It didn't have to be life-changing. It just had to be real. And it had to be in the moment. And that, she thought, was the most important lesson of all. That sometimes the smallest moments are the ones that leave the biggest impact. They don't require a lot of effort, a lot of planning. They just happen. And when you let yourself be open to them, when you allow yourself to connect without expectation, you realize that the world is full of little moments that can make you feel less alone. She smiled, feeling content with the small changes she had made in her life. The walls she had built were still there, but they had softened, and, for the first time in a while, she felt like she was living with the possibility of connection, rather than the fear of it. A week had passed since that evening in the restaurant, but the changes were still there, subtly woven into the fabric of her daily life. It wasn't that everything had drastically changed her routine. Her habits, her preferences were all mostly the same. But now, there was an openness to it all that hadn't been there before. She wasn't holding herself back quite as much, and it felt good in a way she hadn't expected. There was a newfound sense of freedom in embracing the unexpected. She had always been someone who liked control, whether it was in her professional life, her friendships, or her personal time. She had a way of arranging things to fit neatly into her expectations. But the simple act of pretending for a few minutes with that stranger had reminded her how much she had been missing by trying to control every moment. There was something beautiful about letting go, about accepting the unpredictability of life. The next time she went out to dinner alone, it wasn't a lonely experience. In fact, it was one of the most enjoyable meals she'd had in a while. She didn't feel the pressure to distract herself with her phone or to appear busy. She was content simply sitting at the table, looking around, and watching the world unfold around her. She even made a point to strike up a conversation with the waiter, something she would have normally avoided. It wasn't a deep conversation, just casual small talk, but it felt nice to engage with someone, to acknowledge their presence instead of treating the whole meal as a solitary task. That's when she realized something. It wasn't about needing company or filling the space with chatter. It was about being open to the moments that came, however small, and allowing herself to experience them. For so long, she had kept herself wrapped in her own bubble, thinking that being alone meant being in control. But in that bubble, she had missed out on so much. She had missed the beauty of spontaneous moments, the richness of simple interactions, the connection that came from being present with the world around her. She also noticed something else. She had stopped judging herself for needing those moments of connection. She had always viewed her moments of solitude as a form of strength, a way of proving to herself that she didn't need anyone. But now, she realized that it wasn't a weakness to crave connection, even in small doses. It didn't make her any less independent or self-sufficient. It made her human. The next few days unfolded with the same sense of openness. She had a conversation with a neighbor she barely knew, talked to a barista about the weather, and even struck up a friendly exchange with someone in line at the grocery store. None of these interactions were life-changing or profound, but they were moments of connection nonetheless. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was part of the world around her, not just an observer of it. It was funny how something as simple as a stranger's request to pretend could open up a new way of seeing the world. It wasn't about looking for deep relationships or seeking out profound moments of connection. It was about accepting the small, seemingly insignificant moments that made her feel like she belonged. It was about recognizing the beauty in the everyday, in the brief exchanges with people who passed through her life, no matter how fleeting the connection. The idea of pretending had no longer felt like a silly or forced act. It had become symbolic of something much larger. The willingness to embrace the unexpected, to be open to the unplanned moments that life threw her way. She didn't have to hold back, didn't have to guard herself from the possibility of a simple connection. And the more she embraced that, the more she realized that the world wasn't as isolating as it had once felt. There were moments of connection everywhere, if only she was open to seeing them. She found herself thinking about that man, the stranger in the restaurant, and how his small gesture had changed her. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it had been enough to make her realize that sometimes the most important thing was not to try so hard, not to force things into a shape they weren't meant to take. It was okay to let things unfold on their own, to be part of the world, even in the simplest of ways. And as she sat in her apartment later that evening, she reflected on all of this. The changes were small, but they were there. She wasn't seeking out anything big or life-changing, but what she had gained was something valuable. The ability to be present, to be open, to embrace the moments that life gave her without judgment. And that, she realized, was enough. As the days passed, the subtle shift in her perspective became more apparent. She found herself savoring the little things, the small moments that had once felt insignificant. Every glance, every brief exchange, felt like it carried more weight now. She wasn't looking for anything grand or extraordinary. She was just letting life unfold as it was, and in doing so, she was finding meaning in the smallest of things. One afternoon, she sat in a cafe, watching the rain fall outside, the world muffled by the soft patter of raindrops against the windows. She had ordered a cup of tea, and as she sat there, The thought of the restaurant and the stranger crossed her mind again. It was funny how something so simple could have such a profound impact. A few minutes, a few words, and she had walked away with a new outlook on life, one that was richer and more open than before. It was a strange feeling, realizing that a brief encounter could be so transformative. The more she thought about it, the more she understood that it wasn't the stranger or the act of pretending that had made the difference. It was the space that had been created in her mind. The space to be open, to welcome whatever came her way, no matter how small or fleeting. And as she sat there, sipping her tea, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for that moment. Gratitude wasn't something she had always embraced. She had spent so much of her life focused on what was missing, on the things she didn't have or hadn't yet achieved. But now, she found herself more aware of the things she did have, the connections, the experiences, the simple moments that made life feel full. It wasn't about having everything figured out, about knowing exactly where she was headed. It was about being present, about embracing the journey with all its ups and downs, its quiet moments and its unexpected encounters. She realized that the act of pretending, of playing along with the stranger's request, had allowed her to take a step back and let go of some of the control she had held onto for so long. It wasn't about pretending to be someone she wasn't. It was about pretending to be open to what life had to offer, without any preconceived notions, without the pressure of needing it to turn into something else. It was about accepting life as it came, in all its unpredictability, and finding beauty in that unpredictability. And in that moment of reflection, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. It was as if the weight of all the expectations, the self-imposed barriers, had lifted. She didn't have to be perfect, didn't have to have everything figured out. She didn't have to control every moment, every interaction. She could simply be. The rain outside had stopped, and the cafe was slowly filling up with people, some alone, some in pairs, some with groups of friends. She noticed how each person seemed to be in their own world, just like she had been before. But now, she didn't feel quite so separate from them. There was a connection, however brief, that linked them all together, human connection, in all its forms, whether it was shared with strangers or loved ones. She smiled to herself, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. There had been no dramatic changes, no sudden epiphanies. But the shift had happened, nonetheless. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that restaurant a week ago. She had learned to be more open, to embrace the small moments of connection that made life feel a little less lonely. It was a lesson she would carry with her from now on. She didn't need to chase after big, life-changing events. She didn't need to constantly search for meaning or purpose. It was already there, in the little things, the brief interactions with strangers, the quiet moments of reflection, the act of simply being present. And as she left the cafe, stepping out into the crisp air of the late afternoon, she realized that the world was full of these moments. You just had to be open to them, to see them for what they were. Sometimes it was the smallest moments that left the biggest impact. The days continued to pass, each one offering its own set of small, beautiful moments. There was no grand transformation, no dramatic shift in her life. But there was something more subtle happening. She felt different, and it wasn't just because of the changes in how she approached her solitude. It was because of the way she had begun to embrace life without hesitation, without the pressure to force every interaction into something meaningful or extraordinary. The man in the restaurant had given her a gift, though he likely had no idea. He had given her the freedom to be present, to exist in the moment without the need to control everything around her. It wasn't about pretending or acting a role. It was about accepting life as it was, in all its imperfect beauty. She thought back to her evening walks, to the times when she would pass by strangers on the street, eyes locked only for a second before they were lost in their own worlds. She used to feel distant from them, isolated. But now, she felt more connected. It was as if, by allowing herself to open up just a little, she had started to see people for who they were, other human beings. Just like her, trying to navigate the world in their own way. The briefest glance, a smile shared with a stranger, felt like it meant something more now. It was a simple acknowledgement that they existed, that they were there, that they mattered. She began to notice the beauty in the small, seemingly insignificant things. The way the sun filtered through the trees on her morning walk, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. The sound of a child laughing in the distance. A pure, unfiltered moment of joy. The feeling of the wind against her face as she stood outside, closing her eyes for a brief second, just to feel the world around her. It wasn't that she hadn't noticed these things before. She had, but she had always been in such a rush, always thinking ahead, always worrying about what came next, that she had never really allowed herself to be present. She had been too busy looking for something more, something bigger, to notice what was right in front of her. But now, she was learning to slow down, to pause, to appreciate the small things, the moments that made up the fabric of everyday life. She found herself sitting in cafes more often, not because she was looking for anything, but because she had come to enjoy the simple act of sitting and watching the world go by. She could have been busy with 100 other things, but there was something peaceful about just being. It wasn't about forcing herself into productivity or filling the time with tasks. It was about simply existing in the moment, allowing herself to appreciate the space around her, without any rush or expectation. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when she found herself questioning whether she was doing enough, whether she was where she was supposed to be. But those moments were fewer now. She had come to realize that life wasn't about having everything figured out, about meeting some idealized version of herself. It was about being in the present, appreciating the journey as it unfolded, and finding peace in the small, everyday moments. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when she felt disconnected, when she longed for deeper relationships or craved something more. But now, those feelings didn't feel as overwhelming. She knew that she didn't have to chase after them. She didn't need to look outside herself for fulfillment. It was already within her. She just needed to be present enough to see it. As she sat by the window, watching the rain begin to fall again, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, she had let go of the pressure to be everything to everyone. She had let go of the need to fill every moment with meaning or purpose, and in doing so, she had found a deeper, quieter kind of peace. She had learned to be present, to let life unfold without trying to control it. She smiled to herself, realizing that the small moments, the ones that seemed insignificant at the time, had shaped her in ways she couldn't have imagined. They had given her a new way of seeing the world, a new way of being in it. And for that, she was truly grateful. The weeks continued to flow by, each day carrying with it the familiar rhythms of life. She had become more attuned to the world around her, noticing the subtle beauty of the everyday in a way she never had before. The act of being present had transformed her interactions, her experiences, and, most importantly, her relationship with herself. It was like a weight had lifted from her shoulders, a weight she hadn't even realized she had been carrying. She no longer felt the pressure to force connections, or to make every moment feel meaningful. Instead, she had learned to appreciate life as it was. It wasn't about creating a perfect narrative, about curating experiences that fit into a neat and tidy box. Life was messy, unpredictable, and beautiful in its own imperfect way. And for the first time in a long time, she was okay with that. She thought about the man in the restaurant again, the one who had started it all with his simple request to pretend. He had been a catalyst, a stranger who had sparked a shift in her, a change in how she viewed the world. He hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't demanded anything. He had simply invited her to be present, to share a brief, unassuming moment with him, and in doing so, he had unknowingly helped her realize that life wasn't something to be controlled or orchestrated. It was something to be experienced. It had been easy for her to get caught up in the idea of what her life should look like. She had spent so much time chasing after expectations, societal expectations, personal expectations. The idea that she needed to be constantly productive, constantly striving for something bigger. But now, she had learned that it was okay to let go of those expectations. It was okay to let life unfold naturally, without trying to fit it into a mold that didn't serve her. She realized that the need to always have everything figured out had been holding her back. She didn't need to have every piece of her life in place, every goal ticked off the list. It was okay to be in between things, to be in progress rather than constantly striving for perfection. The idea of perfection itself had become something she no longer needed to chase. Instead, she began to focus on the richness of the present moment, the feeling of the sun on her face, the sound of laughter from across the room, the joy of a quiet evening spent doing nothing at all. As she sat in her favorite cafe one morning, watching the rain turn the streets into shimmering reflections, she realized how much she had grown. The woman who had walked into that restaurant weeks ago, alone and uncertain, was not the same woman who sat there now. She had shed layers of self-imposed pressure, and in their place she had found a softness, a gentleness toward herself and the world around her. She didn't have to be anyone else. She didn't have to pretend to be more than what she was in that moment. She could simply be, and that was enough. The phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from a friend asking if she wanted to join them for a weekend getaway. Normally, she would have hesitated, worried about what the trip would entail, how much effort it would require, how it might disrupt her routine. But now, there was a different response rising within her. She didn't need to overthink it. She didn't need to worry about whether it was perfect. All she needed to do was decide if she wanted to go, if she was open to the experience, and the rest would fall into place. She typed a quick reply. "Sounds great. I'm in." The old her would have spent hours questioning whether it was the right decision, trying to anticipate every detail, analyzing whether the trip would be a good enough experience. But now, she had learned that sometimes the best moments came from just saying yes, from letting life unfold without overanalyzing it. She didn't need to have everything planned out. She didn't need to know how the weekend would go. All she needed to do was show up and be present, and that would be enough. As she hit send, she felt a wave of excitement, real, unfiltered excitement wash over her. She wasn't nervous or unsure. She was ready to experience whatever the weekend would bring, knowing that the magic was in the journey, not the destination. In that moment, she realized that letting go of expectations wasn't about abandoning her goals or losing direction. It was about allowing herself to be open to whatever came her way, without the need to control it or force it into something it wasn't meant to be. It was about trusting that life, in all its unpredictability, had its own flow, and that, by simply being present, she would find her way. And with that, she stood up from the cafe table, feeling a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. She wasn't carrying the weight of expectations anymore. She wasn't trying to perfect every moment or orchestrate her life into a flawless picture. She was simply living, embracing what came her way, and trusting that she was exactly where she needed to be. The weekend getaway arrived, and with it a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. No overthinking, no second-guessing, just the simple joy of saying yes to an experience without all the usual baggage of expectation. She packed lightly, almost instinctively, knowing that this trip wasn't about perfecting every detail, but about embracing the moment, whatever it might bring. As they drove toward their destination, she couldn't help but notice the way the scenery passed by the changing landscape, the vibrant colors of the trees, the way the clouds stretched across the sky like a canvas being painted. She had driven this route many times before, but today, everything felt different. She wasn't focused on the destination. She wasn't planning what would happen next. She was simply there, in the car, with the company of friends, letting the world unfold around her. They arrived at the cabin, nestled in the woods, and she was struck by the tranquility of the place. The air was crisp and fresh, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. It was a far cry from the noise of the city, and she felt a sense of calm settle over her almost immediately. There was no rush to unpack, no rush to do anything. They took their time, savoring the peace, and when they were ready, they sat on the porch, enjoying the view, talking about everything and nothing at all. What surprised her most was how easily she slipped into the rhythm of the weekend. There was no pressure to be anything other than herself. She didn't have to worry about how she appeared, about making sure everything went perfectly. She was simply present, enjoying the company around her and the beauty of the world in front of her. She found herself laughing more, speaking with more ease, and feeling connected to those around her in a way that felt natural and effortless. She had spent so much of her life striving for something bigger, something more. But now, she was learning that sometimes the biggest joys came from the smallest moments, the quiet conversations, the shared meals, the simple pleasure of being with people who made her feel at ease. There was no agenda, no need for things to be perfect. The weekend wasn't about creating a flawless experience. It was about being there, being open to whatever came, and trusting that the experience itself would be enough. As they gathered around a fire that evening, the flickering flames casting shadows on their faces, she realized how much she had changed. The woman who had once been so concerned with control, with perfection, with making sure every moment was planned and predictable, was now embracing the unexpected. She didn't need to plan every detail, didn't need to fill every second with meaning. She was simply enjoying the time she had, letting the moments come as they were, and finding joy in the process of living them. They sat there, chatting and laughing, the crackling of the fire providing a soundtrack to their conversation. It wasn't a profound evening, but it was real. It was full of simple joys, the warmth of the fire, the laughter of friends, the peace of the surroundings. She didn't need anything more than that. Later, when the fire had burned down to embers, they all went inside, tired but content. She lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, reflecting on the day. She realized that it wasn't just the trip that had been so fulfilling. It was her ability to be present, to let go of the need for everything to be perfect, and to simply experience life as it came. For the first time in a long while, she felt deeply at peace. It wasn't about seeking out the extraordinary. It was about being open to the ordinary, embracing the beauty of the everyday. She didn't need to chase after perfection or force anything to happen. She had learned that life was already perfect, just the way it was. The key was in being present, in letting go of the pressure to control every moment, and in allowing herself to simply live. As she drifted off to sleep that night, she felt a sense of gratitude for the small moments, for the simple joys, and for the peace that had come from letting go of her need for control. She had learned that life didn't need to be perfect to be meaningful. It just needed to be lived, in all its unpredictability and beauty. The weekend went by in a blur of laughter, conversation, and long, peaceful moments spent doing nothing at all. It wasn't anything extraordinary. There were no grand adventures, no dramatic moments, but in its simplicity, it was perfect. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at ease. She didn't feel the need to rush, to make everything fit into a schedule, or to constantly measure the success of the weekend. She was just there, in the moment, and that was enough. As they packed up to leave, she felt a lingering sense of contentment that she hadn't expected. It wasn't because the trip had been perfect. It wasn't. There had been moments of awkwardness, moments where she felt a little out of place, but that was okay. It was part of the experience, part of being human. And in a way, that imperfection made it feel all the more real. On the drive back, she gazed out the window, reflecting on the weekend and everything she had learned. The most important lesson wasn't about how to plan a perfect trip or how to ensure that every moment was filled with excitement. No, the lesson was about embracing the simplicity of the present moment. It was about letting go of the pressure to constantly be striving for something more, something bigger, and instead finding fulfillment in the small, everyday experiences. The laughter around the campfire, the quiet walks in the woods, the moments when she didn't have to say anything at all, but still felt connected to the people around her. These were the moments that made the weekend meaningful. She realized that these moments didn't have to be planned or orchestrated. They simply happened when she allowed herself to be present and open to whatever came her way. She had spent so much of her life focused on what was missing, on what she hadn't yet achieved. She had been caught up in the belief that fulfillment came from reaching certain milestones, from ticking off items on a checklist. But now she saw the truth. Fulfillment wasn't something you achieved. It was something you experienced. It was in the small moments, the quiet interactions, the beauty of just being. She had learned that fulfillment wasn't something to chase, it was something to recognize in the present. When they finally returned home, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had entered the weekend with a certain kind of restlessness, a feeling that something was missing, that she needed more. But she left with a different perspective. She didn't need more. She already had everything she needed. It was all around her, in the quiet moments of connection, in the simple pleasures of everyday life. She spent the next few days in a state of quiet reflection, allowing the lessons of the weekend to settle in. She found herself appreciating the little things, more the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the feeling of her feet on the earth as she walked through the park. These moments, these simple pleasures, were enough, and she realized that they always had been. She had just been too focused on the future, too focused on the idea of what life should look like, to fully appreciate them. One afternoon, she sat in a park, watching the world around her. Children played on the swings, people walked their dogs, and couples sat on benches, talking and laughing. The world was full of these little moments, these simple joys, and for the first time in a long time, she saw them clearly. It wasn't about searching for something big. It was about recognizing that everything she needed to feel fulfilled was already here, in the quiet moments of everyday life. As she sat there, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything she had learned. Life didn't need to be perfect. It didn't need to be planned or orchestrated. It just needed to be lived, in all its messy, unpredictable glory. And that was more than enough. As time went on, she found that the lessons from that weekend, the ones that had settled quietly into her life, continued to guide her. She no longer viewed each day as a checklist to be completed, nor did she approach life with the same pressure to control everything around her. She had learned that fulfillment wasn't something to be pursued, it was something to be experienced in the here and now. She still had goals, still had dreams, But the difference was that she wasn't chasing them as desperately as before. Instead, she was living the journey, accepting that there would be ups and downs, twists and turns along the way. And that was okay. She didn't need to have everything figured out. She didn't need to know exactly how things would unfold. She just needed to stay open to the moments, to the experiences, and to the people who would cross her path. Her days became richer because she allowed herself to embrace the small moments of connection, the fleeting exchanges with strangers, the laughter shared with friends, the quiet moments of reflection. She wasn't seeking meaning in every single one, but she was finding it anyway, in the simplicity of just being present. Life, she realized, wasn't about creating the perfect narrative. It was about living in the imperfections and finding beauty in the messy, unpredictable nature of it all. And in that realization, she felt more connected than ever, not just to the world around her, but to herself. She had given herself permission to be imperfect, to let go of the expectations that had once weighed her down. And in doing so, she had found a sense of peace and fulfillment that had always been within her reach. The journey ahead would still hold challenges, and there would be moments of doubt. But she no longer feared them. She no longer felt the need to have everything under control. She knew that as long as she stayed present, as long as she allowed herself to embrace whatever came her way, she would find her way forward, one small, meaningful moment at a time. And with that, she smiled, ready to continue her journey, wherever it would take her.